In the polished rooms of London, they called him a freak, a titan who didn't fit into their small, fragile world. Elias was rejected by his firm and mocked by the woman he loved, all because he was simply too much for them to handle. Exiled to the rugged cliffs of Greece, he tried to bury his past in the dirt of an olive grove. He spent years trying to shrink his soul, convinced his size was a curse. That is, until he met a man in the depths of a high-security prison, a legendary prisoner, who looked at his massive frame and smiled. "What they called a flaw," the prisoner whispered, "is the exact requirement for the war that's coming." Suddenly, the man who was too big for London became the only thing standing between a widow and a brutal syndicate. He wasn't a monster, he was the key. Now he isn't just a gangster in hiding, he is the sovereign of the coast, and he's about to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a giant. The 14th of August, 1998, was a day that tasted of salt, dust, and old copper. In the small coastal village of Agios Nikolaos, the heat did not just sit, it pressed. It pressed against the whitewashed walls of the small villas, and it pressed against the lungs of any man foolish enough to be working under the midday sun. Elias was that man. He stood in the center of a neglected olive grove, his chest bare and glistening with a layer of sweat that turned the fine dust on his skin into a dark, muddy slurry. He was a mountain of a human being, a relic of a man who looked as though he had been carved out of the very cliffs that guarded the Aegean Sea. Every movement Elias made was deliberate, heavy with a strength that seemed almost burdensome. As he swung the heavy iron mattock into the dry, sun-baked earth, the muscles in his back rippled like a disturbed tide. He was 34 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a century. They were the color of flint, hard and unyielding, reflecting a past that stayed tucked away behind a wall of silence. In London, they had called him many things. They called him a ghost, a titan, and eventually a monster. But here, in the shadow of the olive trees, he was simply the foreigner who worked until his hands bled. The memory of London usually came to him when the air was the stillest. It was 1995, a cold, drizzling night in a high-end apartment in Chelsea. Catherine had looked at him with a mixture of fascination and genuine terror. She had been his world, the one person he thought might be able to contain the sheer scale of his existence. But as he had stood before her, stripped of his armor and his reputation, she had laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, which would have been easier to swallow. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "You're just too much, Elias," she had whispered, her eyes tracing the impossible breadth of his shoulders and the heavy, terrifying reality of his physical presence. "You don't fit here. You don't fit in this room. You don't fit in this life. And you certainly don't fit in me. It's actually grotesque. You're a freak of nature." That rejection had been more than just a romantic failure. It had been a condemnation of his very essence. It wasn't just the size of his body, but the size of his appetite for life, for violence, and for a brand of loyalty that the civilized world found repulsive. He had been cast out by the firm shortly after, deemed uncontrollable because he couldn't play by the small petty rules of men who hid behind desks. He had taken his money, hundreds of thousands of pounds stashed in accounts they couldn't touch, and he had vanished. A sharp, grating voice broke the silence of the grove, snapping Elias back to 1998. "You're trespassing on a dead man's debt, foreigner." Elias didn't stop his swing. The iron blade bit deep into the earth, severing a stubborn root. He straightened slowly, his joints popping with the sound of dry timber breaking. He turned to see three men standing at the edge of the grove. The one in the middle, Yannis, was a local debt collector who fancied himself a kingpin in a village of peasants. He was a thin, oily man with a silk shirt that clung to his narrow chest. "This land belongs to the widow now," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. He spoke Greek with a heavy, brutal accent, but his meaning was crystal clear. "The widow owes 5 million drachmas," Yannis spat, stepping forward while his two hired thugs fanned out. They were younger, thicker, carrying the arrogant swagger of men who had never met a true predator. "And until that is paid, this grove, the house, and everything in it belongs to my employer, including you, if you're looking for work." Elias dropped the mattock. The sound of the heavy tool hitting the dirt was like a gavel striking a bench. He stepped out of the shade, the full light of the sun illuminating the scars that crisscrossed his torso, reminders of London's back alleys and the price of his former life. The thugs hesitated. They were looking at a man who was twice their width, with hands the size of dinner plates and a gaze that promised nothing but a swift, efficient end. "I don't work for jackals," Elias said. He began to walk toward them, his gait smooth and predatory. Yanis reached into his waistband, his fingers closing around the handle of a small, cheap pistol. "Stay back! I'll put a hole in you, you giant freak!" The word triggered something deep within Elias. Freak. The same word Catherine had used while she looked at the very parts of him that were supposed to be his pride. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He kept coming, his presence expanding until he seemed to block out the sun itself. The air grew heavy with the scent of his sweat and the ozone of impending violence. The first thug lunged, swinging a heavy wooden club. Elias didn't even look at him. He caught the man's wrist mid-air. The sound of the bone snapping was sickeningly wet, echoing through the quiet grove like a gunshot. The man screamed, a high-pitched warbling sound that died in his throat as Elias drove a massive knee into his solar plexus, lifting him off the ground before dropping him like a sack of unwanted grain. Yanis pulled the gun, but his hands were shaking so violently that the barrel danced a frantic rhythm. Elias was on him in 2 strides. He didn't take the gun. He simply wrapped one of his massive hands around Yanis's throat and lifted him until the smaller man's feet were dangling 18 inches off the dusty earth. The third man didn't even try to fight. He turned and ran, his boots kicking up clouds of white dust as he fled toward the village. Elias stared into Yanis's bulging eyes. He could feel the pulse thrumming against his palm, a frantic, desperate beat. He felt a familiar heat rising in his blood, a dark, sensual thrill that came from absolute dominance. He leaned in close, his breath hot against Yanis's ear. "Tell your employer that I am the one who settles the widow's debts now," Elias whispered. "And tell him that if I see your face on this property again, I won't just break your bones. I will tear the life out of you with these hands that everyone thinks are too big." He tossed the man aside. Yanis hit the ground, gasping and clutching his throat, before scrambling away into the brush, leaving his gun in the dirt. Elias stood alone in the grove, his chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave a bitter, familiar ache. He looked down at his hands. They were stained with the earth of Greece and the sweat of his labor. They were the hands of a man who could destroy, but they were also the hands of a man who felt like he had no place to build. He walked over to the edge of the grove where a small stone well sat. He splashed cold water over his face and chest, the shock of it making him gasp. As he straightened, he saw a figure standing on the porch of the small, nearby cottage. It was Sophia. She was wearing a simple black dress that clung to her curves, her dark hair pulled back in a messy knot. She had watched the entire thing. There was no fear in her eyes. Instead, there was a hunger, a deep, ancient recognition of the power he possessed. She didn't say a word. She simply watched him, her gaze lingering on the sheer scale of him, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched his own. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges. Elias knew the cycle was starting again. The peace he had sought was a lie, and the shadow of his past was lengthening, reaching all the way from the grey streets of London to this golden shore. He looked at Sophia, then back at the sea, wondering if there was any place on this earth where a man of his size could truly be whole. High above the village, in the fortress-like prison that overlooked the coast, a man sat in a cell, holding a piece of paper with Elias's name on it. He smiled, a slow, knowing expression. He knew exactly what Elias was, and he knew that the very thing London had rejected was the only thing that could save them all. The 22nd of October, 1998, brought a different kind of heat to the coast. It was no longer the oppressive, dry weight of mid-August, but a humid, clinging warmth that made the skin feel alive and restless. Elias sat on the porch of the small stone cottage he had been renting from the widow, Sophia. In front of him sat a small glass of ouzo, the clear liquid turning milky as he added a single drop of water. His hands, those massive, scarred instruments of both labor and destruction, rested heavily on the rough wooden table. His mind wandered back to the grey, rain-slicked streets of London in 1995. He hadn't always been a ghost in a foreign land. 3 years ago, he had been the primary enforcer for the Miller firm, a position he had earned through a combination of terrifying physical presence and a cold, calculating mind. He remembered a meeting in a smoke-filled back room of a pub in Bethnal Green. The air had been thick with the smell of stale ale and expensive cigars. "You're a liability, Elias," Harry Miller had said, leaning back in his leather chair, his eyes narrow. Harry was a small man who wore suits that cost more than most people made in a year. "It's not just the way you handle the collections, it's the optics of you. You're too big to hide, and you're too loud even when you're silent. People are talking. They say you're a freak, a relic from a more primitive time. We're trying to go legitimate, and there's no room for a giant who breaks bones like dry kindling." Elias had looked at his employer, the man he had protected from 3 separate assassination attempts, and felt a coldness settle in his marrow that had nothing to do with the London weather. It wasn't just Catherine who found him grotesque. It was the world he had helped build. They wanted his strength when the blood was being spilled, but they wanted him gone when it was time to sit at the table. He hadn't fought them. He hadn't argued. He had simply walked into the vault, taken his share of the £500,000 they owed him, and walked out into the rain. He had left them with their small lives and their small suits. Now, in 1998, the scale of his life had changed, but the essence remained. He looked up as the screen door creaked open. Sophia stepped out, carrying a small plate of olives and feta cheese. She was 32, but the loss of her husband and the constant pressure of the debt collectors had etched a fine line of weariness around her eyes. Yet, as she looked at Elias, that weariness seemed to evaporate, replaced by an intensity that made the air between them feel thick. "You shouldn't have done that yesterday," she said, her voice soft but firm. She sat across from him, her knee accidentally brushing against his thigh. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through Elias that made his pulse quicken. "Yannis works for a man named Costas. He is not a man who forgets a humiliation." "I don't care about Costas," Elias rumbled, his gaze fixed on her. "I care about this land, and I care that he thinks he can lay a hand on what is yours." Sophia leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. The movement caused the fabric of her black dress to pull tight across her chest, highlighting the curve of her body. She didn't look away. "Why are you helping me, Elias? You are a foreigner. You have enough money to live anywhere, yet you spend your days digging in my dirt and fighting my battles." Elias reached out, his hand covering hers on the table. The contrast was startling. Her skin was pale and soft, while his was dark, calloused, and large enough to swallow her hand entirely. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. He felt the heat of her palm against his, a slow-building fire that seemed to drown out the sound of the cicadas in the trees. "In London, they told me I was too big for the room," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper. "They told me I was a freak because I didn't fit their mold. But here, the sky is big enough, the sea is big enough, and maybe, just maybe, you are big enough to handle a man like me." Sophia's breath hitched. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of him. The scent of her, lavender and sun-warmed skin, filled his senses. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the line of a long, jagged scar that ran from his collarbone down toward his chest. "I have never seen a man like you," she whispered. She stepped closer, her body nearly touching his. The proximity was intoxicating. Elias could feel the warmth radiating from her, the soft rise and fall of her chest against his arm. In this village, men are small. They talk loud, but they have no weight. You have the weight of the mountains." She ran her hand over his shoulder, her palm flat against the massive muscle. Elias felt a surge of desire so sharp it was almost painful. He reached up, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. He pulled her gently toward him, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. There was nothing explicit in the movement, yet it was the most sensual thing he had felt in years. It was the acknowledgement of his power, not as something to be feared or mocked, but as something to be desired. "I'm going to the prison tomorrow," Elias said, his voice thick with the tension of the moment. "I have an old contact there, a man they call the Admiral. He owes me a favor from the London days, and he knows how the syndicates in this country breathe. If I'm going to protect you, I need to know exactly who we are fighting." Sophia leaned her forehead against his, her eyes closing. "Be careful, Elias. The prison is a dark place, even for a man of your size." "I've lived in the dark for a long time, Sophia," he replied. He stood up, his massive frame towering over her, yet he moved with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone of his stature. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "But for the first time I think I see a reason to step into the light." He left her standing on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the Aegean into a sea of molten gold. He walked toward his small truck. The weight of the task ahead of him settled firmly on his shoulders. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man building a future, and he would break anyone who tried to stop him. As he drove along the winding coastal road, the date on his dashboard clock, October 22nd, 1998, seemed to glow in the fading light. He thought about the Admiral, a man who had been a king in the London docks before fleeing to Greece and ending up behind bars. The Admiral was the only one who had ever looked at Elias and seen a weapon of precision rather than a blunt instrument of terror. The road climbed higher into the cliffs, the air growing cooler and thinner. Far above, the silhouette of the prison loomed against the darkening sky like a jagged tooth. Elias knew that inside those walls, the next piece of his life was waiting. He wasn't just going for information, he was going for validation. He was going to see the one man who might finally tell him that he was exactly the right size for the world he was about to conquer. The chapter ends as the iron gates of the prison appear in his headlights, a heavy, silent promise of the confrontation to come. The 23rd of October 1998 arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was heavy with the scent of ozone and wet stone, a precursor to a storm that had been brewing over the Ionian Sea for days. Elias drove his battered truck up the winding mountain road, the engine groaning as it fought the steep incline. To his left, the cliff dropped away into a churning abyss of grey water. To his right, the jagged limestone walls seemed to close in, echoing the feeling of the rooms he had walked out of in London. The prison, known locally as the Iron Crown, sat perched on a promontory like a gargoyle carved from the mountain itself. Its architecture was a brutalist nightmare of poured concrete and rusted rebar, a stark contrast to the ancient, graceful ruins scattered throughout the rest of the country. As Elias pulled into the gravel lot, the sound of the tires crunching was the only noise in the oppressive silence. He sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Even after 3 years of freedom, the sight of high walls and coiled razor wire sent a phantom chill through his bones. He thought of Sophia. Only a few hours ago he had been standing in her kitchen, the scent of her hair still clinging to his senses. The way she had looked at him, not as a spectacle but as a man, was a weight he carried with more care than any weapon. He felt the phantom pressure of her hand against his chest, a reminder of what was at stake. If he failed to handle the situation with Costas, the peace he had found in her olive groves would be burned to the ground. Elias stepped out of the truck, his massive frame unfolding into the cool mountain air. He wore a heavy canvas jacket that struggled to contain the breadth of his shoulders, and his boots were still caked with the red earth of Sophia's land. He walked toward the main gate, his pace steady and intimidating. The 2 guards in the glass booth watched him approach, their eyes narrowing as they took in his scale. They had seen many men pass through these gates, murderers, thieves, and broken souls, but they had never seen a man who looked like he could simply lean against the walls and bring the whole structure down. The entry process was a slow, deliberate exercise in humiliation. Elias was ushered into a small, windowless room that smelled of industrial bleach and stale cigarettes. "Arms up, foreigner," the lead guard commanded, his voice thin and sharp. Elias complied, his hands nearly touching the low ceiling. The guard began the pat-down, his hands moving over Elias's torso with a mixture of professional detachment and suppressed awe. When he reached the massive column of Elias's neck and the dense sheets of muscle across his back, the guard paused, his fingers tracing the outline of a scar that Elias had earned during a shipyard brawl in the East End. "You're a big one," the guard muttered in Greek, a hint of genuine unease in his tone. "What did they feed you in England? Bricks and iron?" Elias didn't answer. He stared at a spot on the grey wall, his mind focused on the man he was here to see. After a series of heavy iron gates had groaned open and slammed shut behind him, Elias was led deep into the bowels of the prison. This wasn't the standard visitation area with its scratched plexiglass and buzzing intercoms. He was being taken to the infirmary wing, a place where men of influence were allowed a bit more privacy. The room was small and surprisingly clean. In a bed near the window, propped up by several thin pillows, sat a man who looked as though he were made of parchment and wire. This was the Admiral. In the 1980s, he had controlled every crate of contraband that moved through the London docks. He had been a king of shadows, a man who knew the price of every soul in the city. Now his hair was white, and his skin was translucent, but his eyes, bright piercing blue, remained as sharp as a razor's edge. "Elias," the Admiral whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't need to. The power in the room had shifted the moment Elias stepped inside. "I heard a giant had landed on our shores. I wondered if it was you, or just another ghost story told by the sailors." "I'm no ghost, Arthur," Elias said, sitting in a plastic chair that groaned under his weight. "I'm a man looking for a way to keep his head down." The Admiral chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that ended in a coughing fit. He took a sip of water from a plastic cup. "A man of your size doesn't keep his head down, Elias. You tried that in London. Look where it got you. Rejected by the Millers, laughed at by that girl. What was her name? Catherine?" Elias's jaw tightened. The mention of her name in this cold, sterile room felt like a physical blow. "I'm done with London. I have a life here. There's a woman, Sophia. She has a grove, a house. But there's a man named Costas. He's leaning on her." The Admiral's eyes darkened. "Costas? A small man with big ambitions. He's part of the new breed, Elias. They don't care about the old codes. They just want the drachmas and the power. But he's not the one you should worry about. He's just a dog on a leash. The man holding the leash is much further up the coast." The old man leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Elias's with an intensity that was almost physical. "You think you're here for information, but you're not. You're here because you finally realize that the world only has two types of people: those who are small enough to hide and those who are big enough to rule. London threw you away because they were afraid of what you represented. They called you a freak because they couldn't control the scale of you." Elias stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. "I don't want to rule anything, Arthur. I just want to be left alone." "Then you've already lost," the Admiral snapped, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying strength. "You are the perfect instrument, Elias. I've seen thousands of men come and go, but you have the physical dominance and the coldness in your heart that this country is crying out for. What London called a flaw is the exact requirement for the task I have in mind." He reached under his pillow and pulled out a small weathered photograph. He didn't show it to Elias yet. He held it close to his chest, his fingers trembling. "Costas is moving on the widow's land because there is something beneath that dirt that is worth more than all the olive oil in Greece," the Admiral continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And the prisoner in the cell next to mine? He's the only one who knows the coordinates. He told me that he's been waiting for a man who is too much for the world to handle. He told me he was waiting for a man whose size would be his shield." Elias felt a slow, heavy pulse of curiosity and dread. He looked at the iron door of the infirmary, then back at the dying king in the bed. Outside, the first cracks of thunder rumbled through the mountains, the sound of the world finally breaking open. "What is the task, Arthur?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. The Admiral smiled, a predatory expression that looked out of place on his frail face. He slowly turned the photograph around. It wasn't a picture of a person, but of a specific ancient-looking iron key. "The task is to take back what the small men have stolen," the Admiral said. "But first, you have to accept that you are exactly the size you need to be." He paused, his eyes drifting to the door as a guard's footsteps approached. "Go back to your widow, Elias. Taste her, feel her. Remind yourself what you're fighting for, because the next time we speak, You won't be a gardener. You'll be a warlord." Elias walked out of the prison as the rain finally began to fall, huge, heavy droplets that soaked through his jacket in seconds. He drove down the mountain, the Admiral's words echoing in his head. He felt the weight of his own body differently now, less like a burden and more like a fortress. He was heading back to Sofia, but as he watched the lightning illuminate the dark sea, he knew that the man who arrived at her door would not be the same man who left it. The storm that had been threatening the coast finally broke with a violence that matched the turbulence in Elias's mind. It was still the 23rd of October, 1998, and the drive down from the Iron Crown was a journey through a liquid world. The rain was so dense it felt solid, hammering against the roof of the truck with the rhythm of 1,000 small drums. Elias leaned forward, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the old plastic groaned. The Admiral's words were a recurring loop in his head, a mantra that was slowly dismantling 3 years of self-loathing. What London called a flaw is the exact requirement. He thought of Catherine again, but for the first time the memory didn't come with the usual sharp jab of humiliation. He saw her now as a small person in a small world, terrified of anything that didn't fit into a neatly curated box. He had tried to shrink himself for her, to soften his voice and pull in his shoulders, but a man cannot hide a mountain. Halfway down the mountain road, near the pass that led toward the village, he saw a cluster of lights through the grey veil of the rain. A small group of men were gathered around a delivery truck that had been stopped by a fallen pine tree. The trunk was thick, easily 2 feet in diameter, and it lay across the narrow asphalt like a discarded cigarette. The men, 6 of them, local villagers, were hacking at the branches with small hatchets, their efforts pathetic against the weight of the timber. Elias pulled his truck to a stop and stepped out. The cold rain hit him like a physical blow, instantly soaking his shirt and clinging to the heavy slabs of muscle across his chest. He didn't say a word. He walked toward the fallen tree, his gait steady despite the slick mud. The villagers stopped their futile hacking and stared. They recognized him, the giant who worked for the widow, and they stepped back, their eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and awe. "It's too heavy, foreigner," one of the men shouted over the wind. "We need a tractor from the village. It will take 5 hours to get one up here in this mud." Elias ignored him. He walked to the thickest part of the trunk. He looked at the wood, then at his own hands. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a freak. He felt like an answer. He knelt in the mud, his knees sinking deep into the red earth, and wrapped his massive arms around the trunk. He took a breath, drawing the cold, wet air deep into his lungs. He felt the power coiled in his thighs, the density of his bones, and the sheer, unyielding scale of his spirit. He didn't just lift, he exploded. The muscles in his back surged, threatening to tear through the fabric of his soaked jacket. The tendons in his neck stood out like steel cables. With a low, guttural roar that was swallowed by the thunder, he heaved the trunk upward. The villagers gasped. It was an impossible feat of strength, something out of a myth. Elias took a staggering step, his boots sliding in the mud, and with a final Herculean effort, he swung the end of the tree off the road and into the ravine below. The crash of the timber hitting the rocks far below was muffled by the storm, but the silence that followed among the men was absolute. Elias stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, steam rising from his overheated skin in the cold air. He looked at the men. They weren't laughing. They weren't calling him a freak. They were looking at him as though he were a god who had just descended from the clouds to clear their path. He turned without a word and walked back to his truck. He wasn't a gardener. He wasn't a ghost. He was the man who moved the obstacles that others could only stare at. By the time he reached the cottage, the clock on the dashboard read nearly midnight. The house was dark, save for a single amber light burning in the kitchen window. Elias stepped onto the porch, his body aching with a satisfying, deep-seated fatigue. He stripped off his ruined jacket and his soaked shirt, leaving them in a heap by the door. He entered the kitchen, the warmth of the house wrapping around him like a blanket. Sophia was sitting at the table, a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She stood up the moment he walked in, her eyes immediately finding the new bruises on his shoulders and the raw red marks where the tree bark had bitten into his skin. "You're hurt," she whispered, moving toward him. "It's nothing," Elias replied. his voice a low vibration in the small room. She didn't listen. She went to a cabinet and pulled out a small jar of olive oil infused with mountain herbs. She stood in front of him, her head barely reaching the middle of his chest. The height difference was staggering, a physical manifestation of the theme that had haunted his life, but as she looked up at him, there was no fear. There was only a profound, searing recognition. "Sit," she commanded softly. Ilya sat on a low wooden stool, and Sophia began to work the oil into his skin. Her hands were small against the vast expanse of his back, but they were strong. As she rubbed the warm oil into his aching muscles, the contact was electric. Elias closed his eyes, his head falling forward. He could feel every point of contact, the soft pads of her fingers, the heat of her palms, the way her breath hitched whenever she touched a particularly sensitive spot. The sensuality of the moment was thick, heavy with the scent of the herbs and the rain still clinging to his hair. It wasn't just a massage, it was an act of worship. She traced the lines of his body with a reverence that Catherine could never have understood. She didn't find his size grotesque, she found it magnificent. "The Admiral told me something today," Elias murmured, his voice thick with the growing tension between them. "He said that the world is made of small men and big men, and that I've spent too much time trying to be small." Sophia stopped her movements, her hands resting flat against the blades of his shoulders. She leaned forward, her chest pressing against his back, her cheek resting against the warm, oiled skin of his neck. "The world is wrong, Elias," she whispered into his ear. "They fear what they cannot contain, but I have always wanted something I couldn't reach the end of." She moved her hands around to his chest, her fingers tangling in the dark hair there. The physical reality of them, his sheer overwhelming mass and her lithe, determined softness, created a friction that seemed to set the very air on fire. Elias turned his head, his lips inches from hers. He could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, the way her pupils dilated in the dim light. He reached up, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. His hand was large enough to cradle her entire face, yet he moved with a precision that was heartbreaking. In that moment, he realized that the Admiral was right about something else. His size wasn't just a shield, it was a capacity to protect, to destroy, and to love with a force that would consume anyone who wasn't strong enough to stand in the flame. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the cottage, a different kind of tempest was brewing. Elias felt the shift in his soul, the final death of the London ghost, and the birth of something far more dangerous. He was ready to act, ready to take the key the Admiral had shown him, and ready to show Costas exactly what happens when you try to steal from a giant. As Sophia's lips finally met his, a soft, searching contact that promised an end to his long exile, Elias knew that the peace he had sought was gone. In its place was a war, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly the right size for it. The 24th of October, 1998, dawned with a clarity that only a Mediterranean storm can leave in its wake. The sky was no longer a bruised plum. It was a vast, unbroken expanse of sapphire that seemed to pull the very soul upward. The air was scrubbed clean of dust, smelling deeply of pine resin and the sharp, bracing tang of the sea. Elias stood on the small wooden dock at the edge of the village, watching the tide pull at the moorings of his small fishing boat. He felt different. The weight he had carried for 3 years, the feeling of being a misplaced giant, a freak of nature, had been replaced by a quiet, vibrating purpose. He was still large, still imposing, but the shame had burned away in the heat of the storm and the warmth of Sophia's touch. He looked at his hands as he unlooped the thick hemp rope. They were the same hands that had broken bones in London, but yesterday they had moved a mountain for the people of this village. Sophia appeared at the top of the stone stairs, carrying a wicker basket. She wore a simple white linen dress that caught the morning breeze, the fabric translucent against the light. She looked like a vision from an older time, a woman who belonged to the sun and the salt. As she reached the dock, Elias stepped forward to help her into the boat. He caught her waist, his hands nearly meeting at the small of her back. The sheer scale of his grip was a reminder of his power, but as he lowered her into the craft, he did so with the delicacy of a man handling a glass heirloom. "The water will be cold after the rain," Sophia said, her voice bright with anticipation. "The sun will warm it soon enough," Elias replied, jumping into the boat. The small vessel rocked violently under his weight, but he balanced it with an instinctive grace. He started the small outboard motor, the rhythmic chugging breaking the morning silence, as they pointed the bow toward the jagged cliffs to the south. They traveled for 40 minutes, hugging the coastline where the limestone walls rose hundreds of feet into the air. Finally, Elias steered the boat through a narrow opening between two towering rocks, revealing a hidden cove. The water here was a brilliant, shimmering turquoise, so clear that the white pebbles on the floor 5 fathoms below looked close enough to touch. Elias dropped the anchor and turned off the motor. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the hull and the distant cry of a hawk. They were alone. "In London there was nowhere to hide," Elias said, his voice echoing softly against the cliff walls. "Everywhere I went I was seen. I was a landmark, a warning, or a joke." Sophia stood up, the sun catching the gold in her eyes. She reached out, her fingers grazing the heavy, corded muscles of his forearm. "Then let this place be the end of London, Elias. Here, there is only the sea, the sun, and us. And neither the sea nor the sun thinks you are too big." She didn't wait for him to respond. She dived into the water, her body cutting the surface like a silver needle. Elias followed, his massive entry creating a roar of white foam. The cold was a shock, a sudden bracing reality that made his skin tingle. He swam toward her, his powerful strokes moving him through the water with effortless speed. They met in the center of the cove. Sophia reached for him, her arms wrapping around his neck as they treaded water. The contact was electric, the slickness of their skin, the taste of salt on their lips, and the way her small frame seemed to be engulfed by his presence. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it made his heart ache. He held her close, his large hands supporting her in the deep water. "You're perfect," she whispered, her breath hot against his wet skin. "No one has ever said that to me," Elias admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "They said I was too much, that I was a burden." "They were small people," Sophia replied. She pulled his head down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of the ocean and a desperate, burgeoning hope. They swam to the small crescent of white sand at the back of the cove. The sun was higher now, baking the rocks and turning the sand into a warm, inviting bed. Elias stepped out of the water, the droplets cascading off the broad planes of his chest and the heavy, powerful columns of his legs. He looked like a titan rising from the depths. Sophia followed, her dress clinging to every curve of her body. She walked toward him, her gaze never wavering. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply reached out and began to unbutton his damp shirt, her fingers steady. As the fabric fell away, she traced the scars and the massive muscles with a slow, deliberate sensuality. Elias stood still, allowing himself to be seen, to be explored. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. The physical reality of their connection was overwhelming. The contrast between his rough, calloused strength and her smooth, yielding softness. He pulled her toward him, his arms wrapping around her with a force that was both terrifying and comforting. They sank onto the sand, the heat of the sun above and the warmth of their bodies below, creating a world that consisted only of them. Elias felt the weight of her against him, the way her body molded to his as though she had been designed to fit in the spaces he occupied. The physical contact was intense, a symphony of touch that spoke of all the things words could not express. He felt the softness of her skin against the rough texture of his scars, the way her fingers dug into the muscles of his back, and the rhythmic heat of her pulse against his own. It was not just an act of desire, it was an act of reclamation. He was reclaiming his body from the mockery of London, and she was reclaiming her life from the shadows of her grief. For 2 hours, they stayed in that secluded paradise, the world beyond the cliffs forgotten. Elias felt a peace he had never known, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, at exactly the size he was meant to be. But as the sun began its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the cove, the reality of their situation began to creep back in. Elias sat up, his back against a sun-warmed rock, Sophia resting her head on his shoulder. He looked at the narrow opening to the sea, and he thought of the Admiral. He thought of the key, and he thought of Costas. "The peace won't last, Sophia," Elias said, his voice returning to its low, gravelly rumble. "The people who want your land, they aren't going to stop because I moved a tree. They are going to come for us with everything they have." Sophia sat up, her eyes hard and determined. "Let them come. I'm not afraid as long as you are standing in front of me." "I will do more than stand in front of you," Elias replied. "I will make sure they never want to look at this village again." They dressed in silence, the air between them still vibrating with the memory of their connection. As Elias steered the boat back toward the village, he noticed a plume of dark smoke rising from the hills near the olive groves. His heart sank. The transition from the serenity of the cove to the harsh reality of the village was jarring. As they pulled into the dock, the old man who ran the local cafe ran toward them, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Elias! Sophia!" he cried out in Greek. "You must come quickly. The groves. Someone has set fire to the western edge of the property." And there was a man in a black car. "He left a message for you, foreigner." Elias stepped off the boat, his face hardening into a mask of cold London steel. He felt the heat of the fire in the distance, but it was nothing compared to the fire starting to burn in his own blood. The serpent had entered his paradise, and the time for gardening was over. He reached into the basket Sophia had carried and pulled out a heavy iron wrench he had kept there for repairs. It felt right in his hand. He looked at Sophia, seeing the flicker of fear in her eyes, and he knew that the next few days would determine if they would ever return to that cove again. The chapter ends with Elias standing on the dock, the smell of wood smoke filling the air, and the realization that the betrayal he had feared was already in motion. The 3rd of November, 1998, was a day that smelled of scorched earth and bitter regret. The fire in the western grove had been contained by the time Elias and Sophia reached the property, but the damage was a black, skeletal scar across the landscape that had once been their sanctuary. 300 olive trees, some of them centuries old, were now nothing more than smouldering stumps, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of a dying man. Elias stood at the edge of the ash, his boots sinking into the grey remains of the harvest. He felt a cold, familiar rage simmering in his chest, the kind of rage that had once made him the most feared man in the London docks. It wasn't just the loss of the trees, it was the violation of the peace he had fought so hard to build. He felt Sophia's hand slip into his, her fingers trembling but her grip firm. "They did this to hurt me," she whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at the destruction. "They know these trees were my father's life." "They did this to send a message," Elias replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But they made a mistake. They think burning wood will make me leave. They don't realize that I've survived fires much larger than this." They walked back toward the cottage, where a small crowd of villagers had gathered. Among them was Nikos, a man in his early 50s who had worked the groves for 20 years. He had been the one to teach Elias the nuances of the Greek soil, and Elias had come to trust him more than anyone else in the village. Nikos approached them, his face smudged with soot and his eyes downcast. "I tried to stop them, Elias," Nikos said, his voice shaking. "They came in the black car, 4 of them. They had cans of petrol and they didn't care who saw them. They left this for you." He handed Elias a small, heavy envelope. Inside was a single brass casing from a 9mm bullet and a Polaroid photograph. The photo was of the hidden cove where Elias and Sophia had spent the previous afternoon. It had been taken from the cliffs above, showing them on the sand, their bodies intertwined. The implication was clear. They were being watched. Nowhere was safe. "Take Sophia inside," Elias commanded Nikos, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "Lock the doors. I'm going to find Giannis." "Elias, no," Sophia said, grabbing his arm. The physical contact was a desperate anchor in the rising storm. She pressed her body against his, her heart racing against his chest. "It's a trap. That's what they want." "I know it's a trap," Elias said, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. He breathed in the scent of her, now tainted by the smell of smoke, and felt a surge of possessive instinct that nearly blinded him. But a trap only works if the prey is smaller than the hunter. "I need you to stay with Nikos. He knows the house and he has a shotgun in his truck." He watched as Nikos led Sophia into the cottage. He saw the way Nikos's hand lingered on the doorframe, a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation. In London, Elias had survived because he noticed the small things, the way a man's eyes shifted, the way a breath was held. He felt a prickle of unease at the base of his neck, but the urgency of the moment pushed it aside. Elias drove into the village, the tires of his truck kicking up plumes of red dust. He found Giannis at the local taverna, sitting at a corner table with two men Elias didn't recognize. They were dressed in cheap suits that didn't fit the rugged setting, their faces marked by the arrogance of city thugs. Elias didn't slow down. He walked straight to the table and flipped it over with a single, massive hand. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed through the quiet room. Before the two thugs could react, Elias had Giannis by the collar, slamming him against the stone wall. "Where is Kostas?" Elias demanded, his face inches from Giannis's. I don't know," Giannis stammered, his eyes bulging. "He doesn't talk to me. He only talks to the boss." One of the thugs reached for a weapon inside his jacket, but Elias was faster. He released Giannis and delivered a short, brutal punch to the man's ribs. The sound of the bone snapping was audible throughout the taverna. The man collapsed, gasping for air, as Elias turned his attention to the second thug. The man took one look at the scale of the foreigner and backed away, his hands raised in surrender. "Tell Kostas that I have the Admiral's key," Elias lied, the words tasting like iron in his mouth. He knew he didn't have the key yet, but he needed to draw the serpent out of the grass. "Tell him if he wants it, he has to come to the grove, alone." He walked out of the taverna, the adrenaline humming in his veins. He drove back toward the cottage, his mind racing. He had set the bait, but as he turned the final corner toward the property, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Nikos's truck was gone. The front door of the cottage was standing wide open, swinging slowly in the evening breeze. Elias jumped from the truck before it had even stopped moving. He ran into the house, his boots thundering on the wooden floors. "Sophia!" he roared. The house was empty. In the kitchen, a chair had been overturned, and a small pool of spilled wine stained the white tablecloth. On the floor lay Nikos's cap. Elias picked it up, his hands shaking with a terrifying cold fury. He looked out the window and saw a set of fresh tire tracks leading away from the back of the property, not toward the village, but toward the old abandoned quarry in the hills. He realized it then. The betrayal hadn't come from a stranger. It had come from the man he had trusted to protect her. Nikos hadn't been a victim. He had been the lure. He had led Sophia right into the hands of the people who wanted her land. Elias felt the weight of his own body as an agonizing burden. He had been too arrogant, too focused on the obvious threat of Giannis and Kostas, and he had left the woman he loved with a snake in the grass. He thought of her in the cove, her skin soft and warm against his, and the thought of those city thugs touching her made the world go dark around the edges. He ran to his truck and pulled a heavy iron crowbar from the back. He didn't have a gun, but he had the strength that London had called a freakish accident of nature. He was going to show them that a man of his size didn't need a bullet to tear a world apart. As he drove toward the quarry, the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the mountains. He knew he was walking into a massacre, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care if he survived. He only cared that Sophia was still breathing when he arrived. The chapter ends with Elias reaching the edge of the quarry, seeing the black car parked near the mouth of a dark tunnel, and hearing Sophia's muffled scream echoing from the depths of the earth. The 3rd of November, 1998, was the night the light truly died in the mountains above the coast. The abandoned quarry was a jagged, hollow tooth in the landscape, a place where the earth had been torn open and left to bleed. The air inside the tunnel was cold and damp, smelling of ancient limestone, diesel, and the metallic tang of fear. Elias moved through the darkness like a wounded titan, the heavy iron crowbar a cold weight in his hand. His boots crunched on the gravel, the sound echoing through the silence of the cavern. He followed the sound of Sophia's muffled whimpers, each one a needle in his heart. He rounded a corner and found himself in a vast vaulted chamber illuminated by the harsh, flickering beams of portable worklights. Sophia was there. She was tied to a rusted iron chair in the center of the room, a strip of grey duct tape across her mouth. Her hair was disheveled, and her dark eyes were wide with terror. Standing behind her, his hand resting casually on her shoulder, was Nikos. To his left stood Kostas, a man who looked exactly like the city-bred serpent he was, wearing a suit that was too sharp for the dust of the quarry. "Elias," Kostas said, his voice smooth and oily, amplified by the acoustics of the cave. "I was wondering when the local legend would arrive. I must say, the descriptions didn't do you justice. You're an architectural error." Elias didn't speak. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Sophia. He saw the way her body strained against the ropes, the way her eyes pleaded with him to run. "Stay where you are, giant," Kostas commanded, nodding to the shadows. 4 men stepped out from the darkness, all of them armed with high-caliber handguns. Elias stopped. He was a large target, an impossible miss at this range. He felt the weight of his own mass. The very thing that usually made him feel invincible now felt like a liability, a vast surface for bullets to tear into. "Nikos," Elias rumbled, his voice thick with a betrayal that hurt more than any fire. "Why?" Nikos looked away, his face etched with a coward's shame. "They promised me the Western Grove, Elias. They promised me I would be the one to run it once the widow was gone. A man like me. I've spent 20 years in the dirt. I wanted something of my own." "You sold her life for a piece of scorched earth?" Elias spat. "Enough melodrama," Kostas interrupted. "You told Giannis you have the Admiral's key. I know you're lying, of course. The Admiral died 3 hours ago in his cell. But I also know he spoke to you. I want to know what he said. I want the coordinates." Elias felt a cold shock at the news of the Admiral's death. The last king was gone. He looked at the thugs, then at Sophia. He knew he had no leverage, no strategy that could beat 6 armed men in a confined space. "I don't know anything," Elias said. Kostas sighed, a bored, theatrical sound. He nodded to the 2 largest thugs. "Break him. I want to see if the size of the man dictates the volume of the scream." The beating that followed was systematic and brutal. They didn't use their guns. They used heavy rubber truncheons and their boots. Elias didn't fight back at first, terrified that a stray movement would provoke them into shooting Sophia. He took the blows, each one landing with a dull, sickening thud. They targeted his joints, his ribs, and the broad expanse of his back. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. The gravel bit into his skin. He was a shattered icon, a titan brought low by small men with small tools. "Look at him," Kostas mocked, stepping closer and using his shoe to lift Elias's chin. "The great London ghost. You're just a big, useless mountain of meat, aren't you? You don't fit in the world, Elias. You're too big to hide and too slow to win. You're just a freak." Elias looked past Kostas at Sophia. Even through her terror, she was looking at him with a fierce, burning love. She didn't see a freak. She saw the man who had moved the mountain for her. In the darkness of his pain, the Admiral's voice returned to him, clearer than it had been in the prison. "What London called a flaw is the exact requirement. You have the physical dominance and the coldness in your heart that this country is crying out for." The Admiral hadn't been talking about a key. He had been talking about Elias himself. Elias was the key. He realized then that the thugs were standing too close. They were arrogant, lulled into a sense of security by his apparent defeat. They thought his size made him slow. They didn't realize that a landslide doesn't need to be fast to be absolute. Elias felt a sudden searing heat in his blood. It was the same heat he had felt in the cove with Sophia, but twisted now into a weapon of pure, concentrated violence. He reached out, his massive hand closing around Kostas's ankle. The sound of the bone snapping was like a dry branch breaking in a winter forest. Kostas let out a high-pitched, warbling scream as he was yanked off his feet. Elias didn't stand up. He exploded upward. He used Kostas's body as a shield, the smaller man's weight nothing to him. The first 2 thugs fired, their bullets thudding into their employer's back. Elias roared, a sound that shook the very dust from the ceiling of the quarry. He lunged forward, his movements a blur of terrifying, oversized power. He slammed into the first thug with the force of a runaway truck, the man's ribs collapsing instantly. He swung the iron crowbar he had kept hidden under his fallen body, the metal whistling through the air before connecting with the second man's skull. The chamber became a chaotic, echoing nightmare of gunfire and screams. Elias moved through it like a force of nature, his size no longer a burden, but an overwhelming tactical advantage. He was too large to be stopped by anything short of a kill shot, and in the flickering, low light, the thugs couldn't find their mark. He reached Sophia, his massive body shielding her from the crossfire. He felt a bullet graze his shoulder, a hot sting of lead, but he didn't flinch. He used his bare hands to snap the ropes holding her, his fingers moving with a desperate, heavy gentleness. He pulled the tape from her mouth, and for a second time seemed to stop. In the middle of the carnage, their eyes met. He saw her blood-streaked face, the way her chest heaved with exertion and the raw physical magnetism that had drawn them together from the start. "Go," Elias commanded, his voice a guttural rasp. "To the truck. Don't look back." "Elias, no!" she cried, her hand reaching out to touch his bloodied chest. The contact was brief, a searing point of heat in the cold cave, but it gave him the final measure of strength he needed. "I'll be right behind you," he lied. He turned back to the remaining men, his silhouette massive against the flickering worklights. He looked like something ancient, something that had been waiting in the earth for 1,000 years to be disturbed. Nikos was cowering in the corner, his shotgun forgotten in the dust. The chapter ends with Elias stepping into the path of the last 3 gunmen, the iron crowbar raised, and the realization that while he might lose everything tonight, he would never again be too small for the world. The 12th of December, 1998, was a day of crystalline stillness. The winter sun hung low in the Greek sky, casting long, sharp shadows that reached across the village of Agios Nikolaos like the fingers of a giant. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the deep, cold salt of the Ionian Sea. Elias stood on the edge of the limestone cliffs, his boots planted firmly on the rock. He looked out over the horizon, where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky in a seamless, infinite line. His body was a map of the battles he had fought. The scars on his shoulders from the quarry were now faded to a silvery white, and the deep ache in his ribs had settled into a dull, manageable throb. But he walked differently now. There was no longer a slouch to his shoulders, no more attempts to minimize the space he occupied. He moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of a man who owned the earth he stood upon. In the weeks following the night at the quarry, the village had transformed. The local syndicate, stripped of its leadership and terrified by the stories of the foreign titan who had dismantled 6 armed men with nothing but an iron bar and his bare hands, had vanished into the shadows of the larger cities. Elias had not just survived, he had become a sovereign. He remembered the afternoon of the 15th of November, 1998, when he had traveled to the northern coast to meet the man holding Costas's leash. It was a man named Dimitri, an old money aristocrat who dealt in land and blood. Elias hadn't gone with weapons. He had walked into the man's opulent villa, his presence so overwhelming that the guards had simply stepped aside. "I don't want your money and I don't want your land," Elias had said, his voice a low vibration that made the crystal chandeliers in the room hum. "But if one of your dogs ever sets foot in Agios Nikolaos again, I won't go to the police. I will come back here, and I will take this house apart brick by brick until there is nothing left but the dirt you stand on." Dimitri had looked at the scale of Elias, the sheer terrifying physical reality of him, and he had seen the cold London steel in his eyes. He had realized that there was no profit in fighting a man who had nothing left to lose and the strength to take everything. The harassment stopped that day. Now, on this cold December afternoon, Elias turned away from the cliff and walked back toward the olive grove. The blackened stumps from the fire had been cleared, and new saplings had been planted in the rich red earth. It would be years before they bore fruit, but for the first time in his life, Elias was a man who was willing to wait. He saw Sophia standing near the well, her dark hair whipped by the winter wind. She was wearing a thick wool sweater that emphasized her softness, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. As she saw him, a smile broke across her face, a smile that was no longer touched by grief or fear, but by a deep, abiding peace. "The lawyer from the city called," she said as he reached her. "The papers are finalized. The land is ours, Elias. Truly ours. No debts, no shadows." Elias reached out, his massive hand cupping her face. The warmth of her skin was a miracle in the cold air. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and he felt the rhythmic thrum of her heart. The physical connection between them was no longer just a source of desire, it was an anchor. In her eyes, his size was not a freakish accident, it was a sanctuary. "I spent my whole life trying to fit into rooms that were too small for me," Elias murmured, his voice thick with a hard-won wisdom. "I thought if I made myself small enough I would finally be happy. But the Admiral was right. The world doesn't need more small men. It needs people who are big enough to hold the line." Sophia pulled him closer, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head resting against the center of his chest. The contrast of their scales was as beautiful as ever, a testament to the fact that harmony does not require equality, only a perfect fit. "You aren't a ghost anymore, Elias," she whispered. "No," he agreed, looking back at the house, the grove, and the sea. "I am home." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to pierce the velvet darkness of the Greek night, Elias sat by the fire in the cottage. He had taken the money he had brought from London, the hundreds of thousands of pounds that the Miller firm had tried to cheat him out of, and he had used it to secure the village's future. He had funded the local school and helped the other widows who had been squeezed by the debt collectors. He wasn't just a gardener, he was the protector of the coast. He thought of Catherine and the grey, rainy streets of Chelsea. He felt a flicker of pity for the people who lived in those small, curated boxes, afraid of anything that didn't follow the rules of their narrow lives. They would never know the heat of a Greek sun or the weight of a love that required a man of his size to carry it. He reached for Sophia, pulling her onto his lap as they sat before the hearth. The firelight danced across their skin, highlighting the strength of his arms and the grace of her form. The sensuality between them was quiet and profound, a slow-burning ember that promised a lifetime of warmth. He felt her breath against his neck, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and he realized that the size everyone had mocked was exactly what allowed him to feel this much, to protect this much, and to love this much. The story of the London gangster who was rejected because of his size had ended in the mountains of Greece, but the story of Elias, the sovereign of the coast, was only just beginning. He looked into the flames and saw a future that was as vast as the sea. He was no longer running, he was no longer hiding. He was exactly the right size for the life he had built, and as he closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl against the stone walls, he knew that for the first time in 34 years, he was exactly where he belonged. Justice, he realized, wasn't always something that happened in a courtroom. Sometimes it was just a man finding a piece of earth big enough to hold his shadow and a woman brave enough to walk beside it.